Hello and welcome to Fantasy View, a podcast about reviews for fantasy novels. I'm Jason Hubbard. Let me tell you something about Frank Herbert. Herbert was the author of Dune, one of the most famous sci-fi novels there is. He also wrote 5 of its sequels. Well, Herbert and his editor sometimes clashed over sex. No, they weren't banging each other. Basically, the editor didn't want Herbert to put sex in his stories. The problem? Herbert was writing sci-fi stories, and you can't have sex in sci-fi. At least, not in the 1950s and 60s. You see, back then, sci-fi, and by association fantasy as well, were just considered kid stuff, and maybe suitable for teenagers as well. When you reach a certain age, probably 18, you're supposed to leave stuff like that behind. You're supposed to get serious with your life now and not fill your head anymore with fluff. Of course, sex and kid stuff was a big no-no. It kind of still is. And so Herbert's editor claimed that sex in sci-fi and fantasy was also a big no-no. My, how times have changed, as evidenced by the subject of our next review. This is a fantasy book that not only has sex in it, it has S&M. So yes, this is not only a fantasy book, it's in the erotica subgenre too. I picked this one up because I was just looking around a bookstore hoping to pick something up that might inspire me in my own writing. And the half-naked woman on the cover made me curious. The book's title is... I know, no matter how I prepare, once I say it, it's going to sound weird. But hell, you've seen the title already, right? Alright, so here goes. The book's title is Kushiels' Dart. The author is Jacqueline Carey. Now, who the hell is Kushiel? And why would his dart be so damn important that it's mentioned in the title? But it's mysterious titles like this one that make me intrigued enough to want to buy it. So I can discover the answers within. That and half-naked women on cover illustrations. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, that this book was probably inspired by 50 Shades of Grey. So here are the facts. Kushiels' Dart was first published in 2002. 50 Shades was first published in 2011. 50 Shades may have brought mainstream attention to the erotica subgenre, but Kushiels' Dart was available first. So you see, it's really E.L. James who should be bowing down before Jacqueline Carey in worship and adoration, not the other way around. Note to self, make that into a fanfiction stat. Now, let me tell you a little something about world building. It's really simple. It's just making up a fantasy world with its own cultures and certain rules that the people, and maybe even the laws of physics, must obey. Usually an author will work a plot around those rules, because that's something you can do in sci-fi and fantasy and totally get away with. For example, let's say you have a sponge who lives in a pineapple under the sea. And the reason for this is, I can't think of a good reason right now, but I'm sure there is one. The reason I say this is because world building is very important in Kushiels' Dart in order to justify all the hanky-panky that's going on. Because believe it or not, you can't just put a man and a woman in a room together and automatically expect some hanky-panky to occur. I mean, you can, but let's just leave that to fan fiction on the internet, okay? In the nation that Kushiels' Dart mostly takes place in, sex is considered not just a means of procreation, but as a form of prayer as well. So whenever a couple does their thing, their motions and groaning reach the heavens, where a god can tune in like as a pay-per-view channel. I joke, of course, but that is the general idea. Furthermore, Carrie makes up her own religion for her world, which is pretty daring for any author to do. Making up a religion can reveal one's own beliefs and desires. And if you do it to justify something, like, say, murder, it can be pretty controversial. Before I go into plot details, let me add that the world in Kushiels' Dart is basically Earth. When you look at the map in the beginning, you can see it's basically Europe and Western Asia. It's just that the names of nations and some of the borders are different. Many of the new country names are quite realistic and inventive, so I approve. The nation that the book mostly takes place in is France, only here it's called Terre d'Ange. Now, I know as much French as Looney Tunes cartoons have taught me, but I'm pretty sure Terre d'Ange means Land of Angels. The main character is Phaedra, and she goes way back in her life to say that her parents were traveling merchants who lugged her around everywhere. When her father got too deep in debt, he and his wife chose to sell their daughter to one of the houses of night-blooming flowers. Say goodbye to the parents because they never show up again, not even once. So what is a house of night-blooming flowers? Well, it's a brothel, of course, and a high-end one at that. Only the rich and or noble can afford to go to them. Now, I know what you're thinking, and no, Phaedra does not become a prostitute at such a young age. She should be about 10 years old or so at this point. She only becomes a servant instead, learning the fine art of serving without being intrusive. So she does this for several years, serving both gentlemen and ladies who are patrons of this fine establishment. One day, she accidentally pricks her finger and is surprised to learn that the pain actually feels pleasurable. Another girl sees the look on her face, and it totally creeps her out. There's also a time when Phaedra does something naughty and must be punished by whipping, because this is a medieval society, make no mistake. With every lash, she feels pain all right, but she derives pleasure from it too. Then one day, a man named Delaunay comes by, looking to buy a servant's bond. By the way, I may be butchering some of the French names in this book, so please bear with me. He discovers that Phaedra has a scarlet mote, or dot, in one eye, and he recognizes it for what it is: Kushiels' dart. It means that Phaedra has been God-touched, and may be intended to be a kind of avatar for the god Kushiel. I guess now I should explain some of the made-up religion. I won't bore you with all the details, but let's just say that it revolves around a man named Elua. Elua is basically the ultimate hippie. He was the illegitimate son of God who traveled the land spreading a simple message. Peace and love is good, brah. I guess God was kind of embarrassed by him, so he sent some of his angels to bring Elua back to heaven. But each of the angels was smitten by Elua, and they chose to be his traveling buddy instead. Kushiel was one of these traveling buddies. He is God's punisher, a devilish being who both loves and hates his prisoners. As much as he tortures those under his watch, he cares for them as well. Yikes. Another traveling buddy was Nama, a woman who not only loved Elua, but was also willing to lie with others for coin. Because gods have to eat too, you know. So they all traveled a bit, and when they reached a land that was full of nature's bounty, Elua said, "Yo, let's stop here and get our groove on." And so Terra Donge was born. The present-day citizens, or Dongelines, are the descendants of these gods. Anyway, this guy Delaunay ends up buying Phaedra's bond, for he recognizes her as an Anguisette, someone who is God-touched. Someone who's God-touched has special traits that can be advantageous. In Phaedra's case, she derives pleasure from pain, because Kushiel is kind of messed up like that. Oh, hey, where are you going? Yeah, I see your finger near that pause button. Or maybe you're on your PC, and you're about to click on a nearby video thumbnail about, gardening tools. I know what you're thinking, and no, it's not like that. Delaunay doesn't mean to make Phaedra his plaything. If that was the case, then who knows? Maybe I wouldn't have ended up finishing this book, and I wouldn't be making this review. That's not to say that this book is completely harmless, but it's not completely perverse either. Delaunay doesn't make Phaedra his servant, but his pupil. She learns just about everything, like math, science, history, and several different languages. There's also another pupil named Alcuin, a man with long white hair. So whatever happens next, don't say that the author doesn't stress the importance of education. Once Phaedra comes of age, Delaunay asks her a vital question. Would she like to enter the service of Nama? She says yes, so he soon puts her to work seeing certain clients. And yes, the service of Nama is essentially prostitution. It's never actually called that, but hell, you can call it whatever, yet I can recognize it for what it is. I mean, you can put a beard on a camel and put it in a red and white outfit and call it Santa Claus, but you're not going to fool me. The thing will still spit at you and call Wednesday a stupid name and thus ruin the illusion. Of course, you can also say that a servant of Nama is kind of like a geisha. The main difference being that servants of Nama don't necessarily have long-term commitments. Honestly, I'm not too crazy about the prostitution bit of the story. It may be the world's oldest profession, but it can lead to some nasty situations. But remember what I said about world building? This service is something that's allowed by the Donjalin religion, and Phaedra enters it of her own free will. If she hadn't, then it would have been considered heresy, and Delaunay would have had some explaining to do. Basically, what Delaunay wants Phaedra to do is take on specific clients and try to pry information out of them. So not only is Phaedra a servant of Nama, but she's also a kind of spy, and a more translucent one than James Bond at that. Her first client is a man who's known to have a passion for torture. The scene of Phaedra's night with him leaves little to the imagination, as she's repeatedly whipped, among other things. But of course, it's okay for her because she derives pleasure from pain, and she heals quickly, two advantages to being an anguisette, or god-touched. The idea is that Phaedra can hold out for a long time, never saying the safe word that will end the whipping, thereby causing the client to grow affectionate towards her, and more likely to spill his secrets, which will eventually reach Delaunay's ears. Exactly what these secrets are and what Delaunay does with them would be spoilers, so I won't reveal anything beyond that. So where is the conservative voice in this crazy-ass state of things? Is there even one? Why, yes, there is, in the form of Jocelyn Veriel, a master swordsman who was hired to guard Phaedra after Alcuin, who's also a servant of Nama, is attacked at the estate of one of his own clients. Jocelyn is also a kind of monk, a member of the Brotherhood of the Castline Order. Shortly after being hired, Jocelyn makes his opinion known to Phaedra. He's not necessarily against premarital sex. He's against people using knives and whips and pokers to torture people and calling it playing and sport. In other words, he might be the most sane character in the entire book. So, of course, he'll either be spoiled or turned into a villain by the book's end. A few of you might be asking by this point, is there anything more to this book than just sex and drama? Of course there is. Besides the soap opera-like shenanigans, there's also adventure that includes a kind of epic journey. And really, it's this adventure that really redeems the book in my eyes. Even if I disapprove of some of the book's naughty nature, it's still a riveting epic in its own right, which is mostly realistic, yet it also has some fantastic moments involving magic. Without giving away too much, let me just say that something bad happens. It can't get much more generic than that. And Phaedra and Jocelyn are captured and sent to the Scaldi, a kind of Germanic tribal people who is now being led by a charismatic leader, Waldemar Selig. After a lengthy stay, Phaedra and Jocelyn escape and must then work to secure allies for their nation before an imminent war gets in too deep. Kushiels' Dart was an eye-opener for me. I realized that authors like to make grand epics like The Lord of the Rings while putting a spin on that story's timeless formula. Instead of a little man with hairy feet who is essentially a naive innocent, our main character here is a courtesan who prefers her sex spicy rather than sweet. I'd pay real money to see the look on Tolkien's face upon someone making this story suggestion to him. But you know what? The story's adventure and inventiveness made this worth the read, but the number one thing that made me read this book to completion, the number two thing, is the author's writing style. Jacqueline Carey writes with such elegant prose. It's just very beautiful and even poetic at times, without going overboard. In fact, I'd say Carey's prose is the one reason more than any other that made me go on to read the book's 8 sequels. Oh yeah, there are 8 sequels. Did I mention that before? Of course, the one sticking point that will and probably should be a determining factor in your choice to read this book is the sex. Sex may be a form of prayer here, but let's face it, in many cases in this story, it's done for fun. Sex is treated mostly as a recreation, as well as a service for money. After all, Phaedra is basically an indentured servant for Delaunay, and she's trying to buy her freedom back from him. Delaunay is a good master, sure, especially since he gives her an education, but still, the very fact that Phaedra is a courtesan in his service definitely won't sit well with many readers. Actually, I think it's possible that Carey went a little overboard with the sex in the story. I'm not talking about the very existence of S&M in the story. I'm thinking of 2 particular instances near the end of the story in which Phaedra offers herself to 2 different men in exchange for something. Now, Phaedra is on her epic journey at this point, and she's accompanied by many people. So she's offering herself to men in power, not for coin, but to help her and her companions reach their ultimate goal. Now, you could say that Phaedra is offering herself for a good cause, but it kind of has the unintended effect of making men seem like such single-minded simpletons. Is sex being offered? Must swallow pride! Except hanky-panky! Anyway, no matter how you may feel about the sex in S&M, a potential redeeming factor is the fact that characters do feel love for one another. It's not all about people boning each other for money. Phaedra herself comes to love her master Delaunay and her fellow student Alcuin, even though she never sleeps with them. Her feelings seem genuine and never forced, especially thanks to Carey's elegant writing, so she's not entirely a nymphomaniac or something. But let me tell you, this truly is a fantasy story. Of course, there are cases of magic and fictional countries, but moreover, Phaedra never gets pregnant. I mean, she lets her patrons go all the way, essentially making them Babe Ruth for a night, letting them slide into home. And no, she doesn't take a pill, or drink moon tea, or take some kind of herb, or anything. She just doesn't get pregnant. Hell, the very topic of pregnancy is never brought up. It's as if sex is a mere recreational activity and nothing more. I'm sure the author just didn't want to bring it up because it would prove to be a distraction to the story. It was something she just didn't want to have to tiptoe around in order to deliver sex scenes. Still, it felt like something was missing, and it could be a cause for concern because perhaps Phaedra was unable to conceive. That's not the case, though. I know this because the issue is finally addressed in the 4th book in the series. Until then, the reader will just have to remain mystified. Kushiels' Dart is a long book with a big story. I may have made it seem short, but the truth is, there are several story threads that all weave together. And there's even a complete list of characters that reads like a White House dinner party invitation list. Some may say that Kushiels' Dart sounds like Game of Thrones, but with more sex. But that isn't an accurate description. Kushiels' Dart has only one viewpoint and is in the first person. Game of Thrones, or is that Song of Ice and Fire? Oh, the hell with it. Game of Thrones it is. Has multiple viewpoints and is in the third person. But more importantly, Game of Thrones is very bleak and can be downright depressing. Kushiels' Dart is actually very uplifting. It reads like a celebration of life that can make every day feel like Mardi Gras. Yes, the story still does have S&M, but as I've said, the author makes it clear that some characters genuinely love one another and aren't afraid to show it. Can you say that about Game of Thrones? My final word on this book might be something you can figure out on your own, but just in case it bears saying, this book is very indulgent. You can feel free to indulge yourself in the naughty sex scenes without fear of repercussions of any kind, although you may want to hide your boner in public. But it's important to know that, just like with many naughty movies out there, this is a fantasy story and should be treated as such. That's why I highly don't recommend this book to anyone under 18 years old. It's my understanding that teenagers can find it difficult to separate fantasy from reality, especially where sex is concerned. Trust me, you don't want to throw this book into a vast, raging sea of hormones, because something vicious might come crawling out. I read this in my early 20s, and it seemed like a right time for me. If anything, if you want to recommend this book to anyone, it's best that you know this person very, very well, and that you believe that they can handle the content fairly well. And maybe you can get together with this person and, share your ideas about the book and have a very healthy discussion. What can I say? That's it for this episode. I'm Jason Hubbard. Thanks for listening to Fantasy View, and please keep reading. Oh, as for that stuff I said earlier about authors making up their own religions, I assure you, you have nothing to worry about. I like to think that I'm nothing like my namesake.